object-oriented programming concepts for absolute beginners. So in this session, we are going to learn about object-oriented programming. Before learning object-oriented programming, we need to understand what was the programming practice that was available to us before the inception of object-oriented programming. So it was procedural programming. We also call it as procedure-oriented programming. Procedural programming is a classic programming where the programming language is used to tell the computer exactly what to do, step by step. A program in a procedure language is a list of instructions. Each statement in the language tells the computer to do something. The focus of procedural programming is to break down a programming task into a collection of variables, data structures, and subroutines. In procedural programming, the programmer's concentration is on developing the solution to a problem and not on the entirety of the system, which means the programmer just tries to solve the problem by hook or crook and doesn't pay attention on how to map the entire problem onto the system. So let us discuss the problems with procedure programming in detail. In procedure program, there are two kinds of data: local data, which stays hidden inside a function and used exclusively by the function itself, and global data that can be accessed by any function in the program. So in a large program, there are many functions and global data items. The problem with the procedural paradigm is that this leads to even larger number of potential connections between functions and data. You can see the representation of global data and different functions. You can see that the global data are outside the function domain. They are being shared by the functions through various connections, whereas the local data stays inside the function itself. So these large number of connections, they cause a lot of problems in several ways. Firstly, it makes the program structure difficult to conceptualize. Secondly, it makes the program difficult to modify. For example, a change made in the global data item may result in rewriting all the functions that assesses this item. Everything is related to everything else, so modification anywhere has a far-reaching and often unintended consequences. Besides, this arrangement of separate data and function does a poor job of modeling things in the real world. So the problem remains with the procedure programming that you find it difficult to model the real world problems into the function. So there a transition is required, an alternative is required. So an alternative to procedure programming is object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming is meant to address the difficulties with the procedural programming. The main modules in a program in the object-oriented programming are classes rather than procedures. Object-oriented approach lets you create classes and objects that model these real-world objects. So let us understand what are these two things. So object-oriented programming uses abstraction in the form of classes and objects to create models based on real-world environment. The aim is to try to increase the flexibility and maintainability of programs. Because programs created using an object-oriented language are modular, they can be easier to develop and simpler to understand after development. So what is an object? An object can be regarded as tangible things in the real world, such as a car, a printer. An object can also be defined as the roles. It can also be mapped as roles. Roles such as employee, teacher, student. Incidents such as flights, delivery. These can also be modeled as an object. Interactions such as contract, a sale, they can also be modeled as objects. Specifications such as color, shape, they can also be modeled as objects. So an object represents an individual identifiable item, unit, or entity, which can be either real or abstract, with a well-defined role in the problem domain. So an object is anything to which a concept applies. So in object-oriented concept, a class is used to describe properties and behaviors of real-world entity. It is a combination of states and behaviors. A class is a data type and objects are instances of that data type. In other words, we can say classes are prototypes from which objects are created. So basically, this is the relationship between the class and the object itself. For example, we may design a class person. A person can have states such as height, weight, hair color. Persons also have behaviors such as walking, talking, eating. All of these states and behaviors of a person are contained within the class person. They are mapped inside the class for person. This is how we can represent a class. Class name, person, attributes, name, height, operations, walking, talking. So what are the different nuts and bolts of object-oriented programming? First, we need to understand about data members. Class contains data members. Data members are used to store characteristics information of a real-world entity in a class, which means the real-world entity which are we mapping onto the system. These data members are the ones that store the information about those entities. For example, height is the data member of a person class that we just discussed in the last slide. Member functions. Objects in a class have a number of shared properties, features, attributes. Methods are functions that represent the operations associated with a particular class. So in case of person class that we just discussed, walking, talking would be the functions of person class. Therefore, fields, attributes, and methods operations are often referred to as class members. Now, what are the features of object-oriented programming? Commonly, object-oriented programming is also referred to as OOP. So the features are encapsulation. Encapsulation is the practice of including everything inside an object that it needs hidden from the other objects. The internal state is usually not accessible by the other objects. Abstraction is the representation of the essential features of an object. Inheritance allows one class inherit the features or the characteristics of other class. Polymorphism represents having many forms. It allows different objects to respond to the same message in different ways as a response specific to the type of object. What are the two steps of object-oriented programming? Of course, the first step would be creating classes. Without creating classes, you cannot incept objects. So creating classes means creating, extending, or reusing abstract data types. Then, making objects interact. Creating objects from abstract data types and defining their relationships and let them interact. So once we have reached to the understanding of what is a class in an object-oriented programming world and what is an object, we can understand further deep down into the concept. This is it for this session. Thank you.